There are moments in the wild that no camera fully captures, moments that live only in the hands of the people who were there, and in the quiet that follows. This is one of those moments, and it begins as so many true stories do, not with a rescue but with a road no one should have been driving down that night. The storm had been building since mid-afternoon, the kind of February blizzard that doesn't announce itself so much as arrive, suddenly, completely without apology. By the time the wildlife rescue team got the call, visibility on the back roads cutting through the northern pine forest had dropped to almost nothing. Wind moved through the tree line in long, low pulses, bending the branches of old pines until they groaned. The headlights of the truck pushed maybe 10 feet into the white before disappearing entirely, swallowed by the dark and the snow. The call had come from a pair of hikers who'd turned back early, smart enough to leave before the storm fully closed in. They'd seen something in the hollow off the trail's edge. Two shapes, pressed together, motionless. They'd thought at first it was debris, a fallen log, a pile of brush caught by the wind. Then one of the shapes had moved, just barely, and they'd pulled out a phone and made the call. The rescuers didn't know what they were driving toward. The hikers had said bobcats, maybe lynxes had said one looked like it might be protecting the other, had said neither had moved much by the time they left. In wildlife rescue, you learn not to build a picture in your mind before you arrive. You learn to let the truth meet you cold, the way it always does on its own terms. The truck slowed to a crawl where the trail forked. One of the rescuers swept a flashlight across the ditch line, back and forth, until the beam caught something. A small depression in the snow, sheltered on one side by the root system of a fallen tree, and inside it two shapes, just as the hikers had described, pale, still, curled against each other like they'd grown that way. The team moved slowly. In rescue work, speed is a last resort. Panic travels, and even an animal too weak to lift its head can feel the energy of the people around it. They approached low, voices quiet, movements deliberate. The snow was deep enough that every step required effort, and the wind pushed back against them, cold enough to sting exposed skin within seconds. Up close, the two animals were smaller than the call had suggested, lean in the way that animals get when they've been without food long enough that the body starts consuming itself. Their fur was matted with ice, their ears flat, their eyes closed. One was slightly larger, and she had positioned herself so that her body formed a kind of curve around the other, a shape that in the dark and the cold looked almost like a last embrace. The first rescuer reached down, pressing two fingers gently against the larger one's rib cage. A breath, then another, shallow but there. He moved to the smaller animal. Same, both alive, barely but alive. The particular kind of alive that exists right at the edge of something else, where every breath is a decision the body is still making. They lifted them together at first, unwilling to separate them until they had to. The larger female stirred when they moved her. Not a fight, not even a flinch exactly, but a sound, low and guttural. And then her legs shifted, drawing the smaller animal closer even as human hands lifted her away. They worked quickly once the animals were in the truck, wrapping them in thermal blankets, checking for visible injuries, frostbite on the ears, the paws, severe dehydration, the kind of weight loss that suggested days, not hours, without food. The smaller animal settled almost immediately, sinking into the warmth of the blanket with the exhausted surrender of something that has simply run out of resistance. But the larger female, she didn't settle, even wrapped, even warming. She was restless, a soft grunt, rhythmic and low, her sides rising and falling in a pattern that didn't match her breathing. One of the rescuers sat in the back of the truck with her, watching, a hand resting lightly near her without touching. And then, the way understanding sometimes comes, not as a thought but as a physical recognition in the chest, he saw it. The movement beneath her ribs, the tension in her haunches, the way her body was working independently of her exhaustion, responding to something older and more urgent than cold or hunger or fear. He said her name before she had one. He said it quietly, almost to himself. She's in labor. And in that moment, everything they thought they understood about what they'd found on that road, two injured animals sheltering together, one protecting the other, collapsed into something else entirely. The shape she'd made in the snow, the way she'd curled around that hollow, the sound she'd made when they lifted her. She hadn't been shielding another bobcat. She'd been shielding what was still becoming. The wildlife center was warm in the way that only matters when you've been cold enough to forget what warm feels like. Heated pads, soft towels, the quiet hum of equipment doing the slow, patient work of pulling a body back from the edge. The team moved without wasted motion. Fluids, vitals, temperature checks. The practiced calm of people who have done this before, and who know that calm itself is a form of medicine. They named her Mara before the night was over. No one agreed on why. It simply fit. She labored for hours. Hypothermia and exhaustion had stacked the odds against her in ways that no one said aloud, because saying them aloud felt like a kind of surrender. The staff gathered near the enclosure in shifts, speaking in low voices, leaning close to the mesh as if proximity alone could will her through it. The younger Bobcat, smaller, quieter, the one they'd found pressed against her in the snow, paced the adjacent enclosure without rest, pressing his nose to the partition, chirping in a frequency too soft for the room to absorb. The first kitten arrived just before midnight, barely the size of a closed fist, trembling in the straw, impossibly small against the world it had just entered. A breath held across the entire room, and then released. Then a second, then a third. 3 kittens, all breathing, all moving. No one applauded. There was no noise at all, really. Just the kind of silence that fills a room when something has happened that language isn't quite large enough to hold. A few people pressed their hands to their mouths. One stepped into the hallway, not from sadness, from the particular weight of having witnessed something that asks more of you than you expected to give. Mara, exhausted beyond any measure the room could calculate, drew her kittens close. Her breathing slowed. Her body, which had been fighting for hours, finally allowed itself to still. She had arrived at that center minutes from death. She had been starved, frozen in labor, and alone in the way that wild animals are always alone, without the language to ask for help, without any reason to trust the hands that reached for her. And yet she had held on. Through the storm, through the cold, through every mile of that terrible drive, she had held on not for herself, but for 3 lives that the world didn't yet know existed. The rescuers dimmed the lights and let the room breathe. Outside, the snow was still falling. Inside, for the first time in a long time, it was warm. Weeks have a way of moving differently inside a wildlife center. Not faster or slower exactly, just quieter, measured not in dates but in small victories. A kitten taking its first unsteady steps across straw. A mother lifting her head higher than she did yesterday. A room that was once held in collective breath slowly learning how to exhale. Mara healed the way wild things heal. Not gracefully, not on anyone's schedule, but completely. The frostbite receded. The weight returned. Her eyes, which had been dull and distant in those first fragile days, sharpened back into something alert and certain. She watched everything. The caretakers, the lights, the door, with the particular attention of an animal that has decided, quietly and without negotiation, to survive. Her kittens grew fast. 3 of them, 2 females and a male, tumbling over each other with the reckless confidence of creatures who have never known anything but warmth and safety. Mara taught them the way mothers teach, not with patience, exactly, but with consistency. She showed them how to crouch low and still when something unfamiliar entered the room, how to use their bodies rather than their voices, how to trust instinct before anything else. The staff started calling them the Snow family. No one assigned the name, it simply appeared one morning in the logbook and stayed. The younger male Bobcat, still housed nearby, never fully settled. He remained close to Mara's enclosure, always within sight, always listening. Whether he was her mate, her litter mate, or simply the companion chance had pressed her against in that hollow of snow, no one could say with certainty, but the bond was visible and unambiguous. A relationship older than the center, older than the rescue, older than any human understanding of what these animals owed each other. Caretakers who had worked there for years began finding reasons to linger near the enclosure, not to intervene, just to watch. There is something clarifying about witnessing recovery in a wild animal. It asks nothing of you. It carries no narrative about strength or inspiration or meaning. It simply happens honestly in front of you and leaves you quieter than you were before. But as the weeks stretched toward spring, a shift moved through the center, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. The kittens were growing beyond what walls could hold. Mara's gaze, when it met the eyes of her caretakers, had changed. It was not gratitude exactly. It was not trust in the human sense of the word. It was readiness. And the people who loved her most already knew what that meant. Spring in the northern forest doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in pieces, a patch of bare ground where snow had been, a sound returning to the tree line, light lasting a few minutes longer than the day before. By the time the release date was set, the forest that had nearly taken Mara's life had become something else entirely, green and open and unhurried, as if it had been waiting. The drive to the release site was quiet. The caretakers didn't fill the silence with conversation. There wasn't much to say that hadn't already been understood. In the weeks of feeding and watching and stepping back, in the slow and deliberate work of preparing a family to leave, some goodbyes don't need words. They've already been said in smaller moments, over time without anyone naming them. The truck stopped at a ridge where the tree line opened into a wide corridor of old growth, the kind of forest that feels less like a place and more like a presence. The doors were opened slowly. The air outside was cool and smelled of pine and wet earth and something wilder underneath. Mara stepped out first. She paused at the threshold, not from hesitation but from attention. Her nose lifted, her ears moved independently, reading the air. Behind her, 3 half-grown kittens pressed close, watching their mother the way they always had, as the first and final authority on what the world required of them. She looked back once. It lasted only a second, long enough to be real, brief enough to remain wild, and then she moved forward into the brush, her kittens folding in behind her, their spotted coats dissolving into the dappled light the way water returns to water. The younger male followed last, pausing at the same spot Mara had, as if honoring the same invisible line. Then he too was gone, and the forest closed around them, quiet and complete. The caretakers stood at the ridge for a long time without moving, hearts full in the way that loss and rightness can coexist when you've done something difficult and true. Weeks later, a motion-triggered camera caught them on a trail through the snowmelt. Mara moving steady and low through the brush, 3 young bobcats tracking her footsteps exactly, all 4 of them strong, all 4 of them home. The team watched the footage late one night, the room dim, no one speaking, smiles that didn't quite hide the tears behind them. The kind of moment you don't share right away. You hold it first, because some things need to be felt before they're told. She had been rescued once. What she truly needed was the chance to rescue her own.